of us. But for today, I'm very excited to welcome three guest speakers for our webinar this afternoon. First, we have Stephanie Poirier, who is a senior policy analyst in the Standards to Support the Resilience and Infrastructure Program at the Standards Council of Canada. Prior to joining the SCC in 2022, she spent over 10 years working in government relations and advocacy in the natural resources industry, focusing on international standards for wood packaging. Our second speaker is Marla Desat, who is a technical outreach officer with the National Research Council of Canada. She delivers strategic and technical outreach and knowledge translation activities to support the efforts completed under the NRC's climate change adaptation initiatives. And these initiatives will provide the knowledge to adapt public infrastructure, inform changes to building and infrastructure codes, and create guides, standards, tools, and technical solutions for climate resilience. So Stephanie and Marla are going to present first. They're going to present together, and then we will hear lastly from Yash Vyas, who is the research director with Recover, working in developing a regional roadmap for deep retrofits across Atlantic Canada. He's a building scientist with expertise in sustainable systems, decarbonization strategy, building envelope design, and building automation. He has contributed to major retrofit and decarbonization initiatives through energy modeling, retrofit analysis, and building condition assessments. So really excited to have all three of them with us here this afternoon. They have lots of great knowledge and resources to share. Mintaka is going to be sharing links in the chat as we go. And as I said, we'll also be creating that resource summary afterwards, so don't worry if you miss a link or two as we get going here today. All right, so I'm going to throw things over to Marla and Stephanie, and you should have control of the slides.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And thanks everyone for joining us today, and to everyone at Climate Atlantic for inviting us to come and speak today. This is really exciting for us. We like to share the work that we're doing. We think it's really exciting. Standards and research can sometimes be a little dry, but I hope that you'll enjoy what we're going to walk you through today, and that you find something that's useful to your work and that you can apply in what you do. So we're going to tell you a little bit about who we are. We are both from federal government organizations, so we're going to start by telling you a little bit about us. We will refrain from using too many acronyms, although you will hear NRC and SCC, our two organizations, a couple of times. It's hard to keep it out of what we say when we're so used to saying it so much. And we're going to walk you through a little bit about what exactly are standards, where do they come from, what do we mean when we talk about standards and different types of these things. And then we're going to dive into really the meat of what we're looking at this afternoon, and talk about standards and guidance for specific hazards. So we've got some different tools that you can use for all these different hazards. We're going to focus in on coastal flooding and erosion, but we're also going to talk about some of the other hazards you might be thinking about. So wildfire, urban flooding, high winds, extreme heat. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how equity plays into all these pieces. And then we'll have some time for some questions. So just before I tell you about the National Research Council, I want to talk about this pathway. And this pathway is how we go from a brand new idea or a change or something that we're going to do, and how it gets into actual use and application. Not every new idea or change is going to go through exactly every step in this pathway, but I find it's a useful way to think about how do we go from having an idea of how to do something differently to having it be something that everybody is doing. When you have a brand new way of doing something or a way that you're changing, you're going to start out with some design and testing, some research. Maybe you're just trying to test it out to see if it even has any merit whatsoever. And then if it shows some promise, you move into a stage of refinement where maybe you put it into a pilot project. You do different activities to assess if it's working well. You look at how you can improve it. And then you move into what we would call a growth phase, where it's becoming more widely accepted, is more proven, more demonstrated. And if we continue on down this pathway, we come into this area of consistency, where this new idea has now moved into appearing in best practice information and guidance. It might be in an industry standard. It might be the normal thing that everybody does. And then we end up in this final end point of codification. And this is where that new idea, from starting off from being a brand new out of left field thing, becomes something that is required by policy or practice. is required by regulation or a code or a bylaw, or it's integrated into things like a national standard of Canada, which is a specific type of document that we're going to talk about. So along this pathway, we have some work that's done at the National Research Council of Canada. We are the federal government's federal kind of research arm. We have labs and offices all across the country. We have a number of different research centers, and we do work all the way from aerospace research to health research to construction research, which is where I work. So I'm with the Construction Research Center at the National Research Council, and we have a program that we call the Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative, which is just the title that we use to describe a set of research projects looking at climate resilience. We have projects on everything that we build, so from single family homes all the way up through roads to bridges. I like to say that if it's got concrete or wood or steel in it, chances are we have somebody doing research about how climate change impacts that structure. So the QR code and the some of the links that are being sent will take you to a list of all the things that we've done. We've been working on this for over 10 years now, and we really focus into the early parts of this pathway. So we do some of that fundamental research. We've got this new idea of a brand new way to solve something, trying to refine it and pilot it, moving it into that phase of growing, and then bringing it a little bit towards consistency, and where we publish some kinds of guidance documents. We do a lot of technical research papers, research reports. We do a lot of these pilots and partnerships, everything from computer modeling design up to actually trying something in a lab to trying something in a field, and kind of moving that idea along this pathway for it to be able to be used. As I said, we've been doing this for almost 10 years, so I could take up your whole afternoon telling you about all the different things that we've done. You can see a lot of the current results that are published on our website. There's different kinds of guidance documents, as I said. There's some standards that we've funded. There's some analyses that are available. And if you want to dig deep on that, you can check out our website and see what's been published. And that site gets updated regularly as new things come out. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steph to talk a little bit about the Standards Council of Canada.
Thank you, Marla, and thank you for having us. So, in case you're not familiar with the Standards Council of Canada, first, no worries. Most people haven't heard of us. We are a federal crown corporation, and basically we are responsible for overseeing the standardization system in Canada. So we don't develop standards ourselves, but we set the rules and requirements for how certain standards are done. And we also represent Canadian interests at international standard setting tables like ISO. And then we also are the largest accreditation body in Canada. And so in this pathway, we are mostly on the consistency and codification side of things. And I work specifically for a program called the Standards to Support Resilience in Infrastructure program. We've been around since 2011 in terms of our northern work. That's the Northern Infrastructure Standardization Initiative. But we work across 6 work streams. We're now in about like our second phase of work. So aside from the northern stuff, we have kind of like I think of it as a catch-all bucket called strengthening assets against extreme weather events. So that would include, anything from high winds to flooding to wildfires. We have another on integrating risk management. The work that I lead is nature-based solutions, and I also lead our work on coastal adaptation. We have another work stream on climate resilient transportation. So as you can see, mostly focused on adaptation, but now we're getting into the mitigation side a little bit with this newer stream, the low carbon building materials. Still in a bit of an exploratory phase in that. My colleague Arden, who leads that work, is still working on her roadmap for the kinds of gaps and stuff that we might address. So let's talk about standards. I like to say that standards are only really pretending to be boring to hide how powerful they are. And I hope that you will find that by the end of this presentation. Essentially, what we're talking about when we're talking about standards, basically it's a document that outlines the best way to do or make a thing, right? And they're voluntary by default, but they can be made mandatory if they're enforced by law, incorporated into, legislation or regulations, that kind of thing. And one thing that I like to distinguish from the beginning is that um, there's all kinds of standards, but the Standard Council of Canada, we're more concerned with consensus-based standards, so a national standard of Canada. And the distinction I would make is that a private standard, like an industry standard or a professional standard, they're developed, for that industry by that industry, right? So it's like a very insular process, but a national standard of Canada follows a very rigid process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, in terms of what makes a national standard of Canada, the first thing to know is that only SCC accredited standard development organizations can develop a national standard of Canada. So that would be like a CSA group or a B&Q. And I would say that probably the most important element of this process is that the technical committee has to have a balance of interests. So, you're gathering a bunch of people from different, parts like government, industry, academia, civil society, and they might have even competing interests, but you're gathering them together and they have to agree on what goes into that standard. Now, beyond the interest part, you also have to have geographical representation so that, you don't end up with a bunch of people from Toronto, making decisions for the rest of the country, right? And so these people, they agree on what goes into the draft, but then it goes out for public review, which gives everyone and anyone a chance to provide feedback on what might ultimately become the standard. And then once it's published, it's done so in both official languages. So that's another requirement. There are a lot of different types of standards. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, and these aren't strict buckets. They're just like general types. So, for example, like a prescriptive standard would be like for how things are made. So, for example, like the hockey helmets or work boots, you might have noticed like a green triangle, like CSA certification logo. That would be something associated with the prescriptive standard. And then you have something like a management system standard. ISO 9001 would probably be the most well-known of those. Um, Now, I don't know if you have ever run out of small talk with an acquaintance or a friend. Maybe you're looking for some interesting conversation starters. Well, you've come to the right webinar. We want to help you out with that. So next time you are talking to a parent at your kid's soccer game or you're at a boring dinner party, feel free to use, one of these zingers. So first up, did you know the National Standards of Canada are considered de-risked because they are based on the consensus of experts and stakeholders? That's right. They are vetted by a nationally representative group of experts representing a balance of interests. I mean, who would not be delighted by this knowledge? I don't want to know them. The second one, did you know that National Standards of Canada are kept current by following a 5-year review cycle? That's right, because every 5 years, the standards, National Standards of Canada, they're reviewed and either reaffirmed as is, updated with the latest practices and technology, or withdrawn altogether if they're no longer relevant. And then finally, did you know the National Standards of Canada can reduce effort and time spent on planning, design, and implementation? Because standards can outline steps to follow and all kinds of provisions to take out a lot of the guesswork. So, something to consider. Now, something else to consider is how standards can potentially reduce your legal liability. Now, first and foremost, I have to say up front that this is not legal advice, okay? Um, so SEC funded a research report on climate resilience standards and legal liability for municipalities and other groups like practitioners. And the report looks at an important question. Can following climate resilient infrastructure standards help public and private organizations show that they've met their duty of care under Canadian law? So in its simple terms, it looks at whether using recognized standards can help demonstrate that an organization acted responsibly to avoid causing foreseeable harm. Spoiler alert, they found that using standards can help. But because it's written by lawyers, there's some nuance. So first, Standards support statutory duties of care. Standards help show that you did things properly, but they don't override legal requirements, so the law still applies. Using climate resilience standards shows that you went above and beyond what was legally required of you, which is a good look. Second, credibility and transparency matter. So standards developed through open, consensus-based processes like the ones I was just telling you about tend to be taken more seriously than informal guidance. Because they're developed through broad expert input and review, they carry more weight when demonstrating due diligence. Now, documentation is critical. Standards are most effective when they're clearly built into decision making and backed up with solid documentation. Being able to show how and why a standard was applied matters, and in some cases, third-party verification can further strengthen an organization's position. And last, standards must be current and used appropriately. So using outdated standards, ignoring new scientific information, or failing to account for changing environmental conditions like more intense rainfall or flooding can increase risk and liability. So applying the most relevant and up-to-date standards is essential. And standards can be incorporated into project designs, contracts, and construction practices. And for long-term projects, teams should revisit the standards periodically just to ensure they remain applicable. So now we're going to talk about standards and how it relates to climate change. Like, we don't have time, unfortunately, to get into the whole climate science and all of that. But I think we can all agree, like, we're in a bit of a pickle, and this pickle is putting stress on the built environment. So, ensuring that our infrastructure is resilient to climate change is really critical. And standards can present a solution to this, right? Because they can specify performance and material requirements that are used to address climate risks. So that's great. But there's a couple other problems. So first is that many standards have been developed with historical climate data in mind, which assumed to be a constant, and we're seeing like that's no longer the case. And the other problem is that standards are by default voluntary unless they're enforced by law. Fortunately, there's some solutions. For the first problem, I mean, we are working with the NRC as well to update existing standards to include climate considerations, and also leading the development of new ones that are addressing specific climate issues. And then a solution where you would come in is that professionals like the construction industry can proactively include climate resilience considerations into their projects and programs by proactively seeking out these standards. Next, I think some of you will see where this is going, and I see that my punchline has been revealed. But in case you're not familiar with the story of the three little pigs, I'm just going to refresh your memory. So you have these three pigs. I think they were brothers. I don't really remember. And one lives in a straw house, one lives in a wood house, one lives in a brick house. And then you got this big bad wolf that's trying to get at them for whatever reason. And this wolf, he's got a powerful set of lungs on him, and he huffs and he puffs and he takes down the straw house, he takes down the wood house, and he gets to the brick house, and then he can't take it down. It's just too sturdy. So to bring this back to standards, the straw house is the equivalent of some random building a house using YouTube tutorials. So it might look like a house, it might, provide okay shelter, but it cannot survive a wolf with powerful lungs. And the wood house is the equivalent of following the National Building Code of Canada. So it looks like a house, provides good shelter, it's pretty sturdy, but unfortunately not enough to survive a wolf huffing and puffing. And then finally, you get to the brick house. So the brick house is like building a house following not only the National Building Code of Canada, but also using voluntary standards that were developed by consensus of industry and experts. So it is therefore too sturdy for even the angriest wolf to take down. And yes, the wolf does mean climate change in this case. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Marla to talk about codes.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, so one of the things we haven't really talked about too much in this standards discussion is, well, what's a code? So as Steph walked through, standards establish those accepted practices and different kinds of requirements. And you can have these national standards of Canada that follow that specific process and are developed by accredited standards developers. Codes, the word code doesn't have kind of any restrictions on it. So you can call all sorts of different things a code, and it really depends on exactly which document you're looking at, what that word means. So codes are usually, though, a mandatory document. So usually we use code to refer to something like the Canadian Electrical Code, which is made into a requirement through regulation, and other kinds of codes like this. And codes are usually quite large. They tend to be very broad in scope, and pretty often they actually reference many other standards within them. So if something is calling itself a code, take a second to have a look, understand what that document is, because it can vary depending on where you are and what you're looking at. The one that many of you will be familiar with is the National Model Construction Codes, and these are adopted by the provinces and territories through regulation to make them mandatory. The ones pictured here are the 2020 codes, and the 2025 editions were just published at the end of December of last year. And those have made a little bit more progress towards resisting that huffing and puffing of the wolf that is climate change. So as a result of some work that the National Research Council has done, along with Environment and Climate Change Canada and a number of other institutions across Canada, the data that's used in the 2025 codes has now been updated so that instead of using backward-looking data that remains static, it's now based on data that does look forward, so that buildings built with those new data in the new codes are better able to withstand the forces that they're going to face. So that, as I said, just came out at the end of December, and there is a process where those model codes that are published get adopted by the provinces and territories. But you will be seeing some new little bit of climate change adaptation integrated into those codes coming to you soon. All right, and with that, we've downloaded all the details and the information to you about who we are and what we do and just what is a standard. So we're going to get in really to the specific tools that we want to show you and highlight for you on specific climate hazards and risks. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about wildfire. Now, this is a top of mind risk for many people across the country, and especially in Nova Scotia. Like we had a very significant fire season last year, and in 2023 had a really significant, the most devastating wildfire season on record for Nova Scotia. I'm sure that many of you either yourselves or had friends and family who were impacted by those wildfires and had to evacuate or otherwise take action for that. And it's as a response, we've seen significant investments at all levels of government. So at the municipal and the provincial and the federal level, there's a lot of effort and focus going into how do we manage wildfires, how do we keep people safe. And one of the things that I want to show you is a document that can help a little bit with this. So in 2021, the National Research Council published the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires, or WUI fires. So wildland urban interface just means when you've got that wildfire that moves into an urban area, so where you've got a place where people are living that's close to the wildland, and you have that ability of that fire to then move from burning trees to burning homes. And so this guide, it collects together the latest and greatest in national and international information on managing wildfire risks. It looks at the overall community level, it looks at the area around a structure, and it looks at the structure itself. And it has information in it like this image here, where it's showing different options for materials. So if you're building new or doing a major retrofit, there are a number of different options that you can choose in terms of just materials, some of which have no change in your cost. It's really just a change in your choice of what you're picking in order to reduce your risks from wildfire. So this is a fantastic guide. It's really an excellent document. It's also very, very large. It is, if you want some really deep reading, I'm sure that, and if this is the topic that you enjoy, you'll get a lot out of this document. But it really is the kind of thing that you can flip through, that you can search through, that you can look for the things that are relevant to what you're doing. And since its publication, it's been used to inform updates to Fire Smarts checklists. It's been used in Lytton as part of a homeowner resilient rebuild program to help advise homeowners on what they can do when they're rebuilding their homes from that devastating fire to make it less at risk for the future. And overall, it was found to have significant potential benefits if we were to put it into practice across the country. So an analysis found that it would have an overall benefit to cost ratio of about 4-to-1 if we followed these guidelines from coast to coast to coast. And if you're in an area where you have high hazard for wildfire, that benefit could go up as high as 14-to-1 in terms of avoided costs. And we're continuing to build on that document. So working with the Standards Council of Canada, we have new standards that are going to be coming out based on this document. And there are 2 standards and 1 guidebook that are coming out. These will be coming out next year and by March 2028 at the latest. There's a standard on community planning, resources, and outreach in these wildland urban interface areas. So that's really more at the community scale. So maybe more of more interest to people who are working with municipalities or other regions. And the second standard is specifically about the fire risk mitigation in the structure ignition zone. So close to the structure and at the exterior of the structure, what can you do in those spaces? And then there's an accompanying guidebook that will be published. And what this does is it takes that big, detailed advice from that large guide on wildland interface fires and turns it into standards that are easier to follow and implement. So it puts them into a format where you can go, yes, 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 I've done what the standard says. I know that I'm meeting, that I've improved my resilience against these risks. So watch for those coming out in the next couple of years here. So with that, I'm going to move on to talking about some coastal flooding and erosion documents. And the first one that I want to show you is another NRC published guidance document. So nature-based infrastructure for coastal flood and erosion risk management was published just a couple of years ago, and it's available. It and the WUI guide that I was mentioning are both available in English and French. And this is really a guidance document on how to integrate nature and nature-based solutions into your coastal flood and erosion risk management. And this comes out of years of work looking at both computer simulations, lab work, and field studies to provide advice on how to use things like salt marshes and brushwood dams and many other different kinds of solutions that build on nature to help us protect our coasts from these concerns. And so you can kind of see just in the upper right corner of this image, you can see that there is a road along there. So this is actually a living dike being built on the west coast in Boundary Bay. It's very, very close to a major road there and a pathway. And they're looking at ways to use things like salt marsh restoration to reduce the impact that waves have on this coastline and be able to protect and keep that road safe from flooding and erosion. That guide has case studies and information and is informed by pilots done all across the country, but I wanted to highlight that there are a couple of very interesting Atlantic pilot and study sites that informed this guide and are still continuing as research projects. So we have work looking at using a sand engine and engineered coastal wetlands in Shippagan. We have work looking at nature-based options to protect soft cliffs from erosion at St. Croix Island. In the Chignecto Isthmus, there's some really interesting work happening on protecting dikes and other flood protection structures with restoring marshes. So looking at both natural marshes and kind of constructed marshes and how we can use those to protect and reduce the risks of flooding and erosion. And in Newfoundland, there's a project looking at the potential for using these kind of vegetation-based solutions because Newfoundland, of course, has different flora, then they're not going to be able to use the exact same plants as you could in the Maritimes up in Newfoundland. So what does this mean for the work that you do? Well, leveraging standards is a little bit like following a choose your own adventure book. So you can kind of go through and pick where you want to bring these in and apply them. So if you've got a problem, if you're looking at how to protect your coastline from flooding and erosion, you want to understand first, where are you? What shoreline are you looking at? Is there any shoreline management happening? Is there any assessments that have been done, and what is the specific coastal flood risk that you're facing for your structures or for the work that you're doing. So you might apply something like the CSA W224 coastal flood risk assessment for buildings and infrastructure. You'll find that all the standards have extremely catchy names. But you might apply that to the work that you're doing. You might look at documents like there's a great document called Managing Rising Risks, Climate Resilient Shorelines. They'll help you look at options for dealing with hotspots and what you can apply here. You might look at something like looking at there's an equity guide on looking at climate resilient infrastructure from that lens and applying that to see if there's particular parts of your project that have an outsized impact on one group over another. And as you're kind of moving through evaluating how you want to address a shoreline, address a coastal erosion issue or a coastal flooding issue, you will need at some point to weigh your options and to understand what the costs are. And so there's a new document coming out in just a couple months in June 2026 that looks at coastal options appraisal to help you with that stage. And maybe you need to dive deep on how you've decided that you want to look at restoring the marsh. Well, how do you do that? Well, that design guide that I was talking about has case studies, has information that you can then reference and use to bring in and ultimately arrive at that successful point of achieving climate resilience for the work that you're doing. So I mentioned a couple of these in that choose your own adventure. So this is just a little bit of a slightly easier list for you to refer back to of some of these documents that if you're really digging in deep on these pieces, these might be helpful to you. And Climate Atlantic also has a great toolkit on coastal risks that you should check out as well. So all these pieces can get woven into the work that you're doing to make sure that you're considering these risks in anything that is facing them. And I want to zoom out just a little bit to think about, to bring this into a little bit more practical terms. Let's imagine that we want to build a brand new coastal hotel somewhere. So we've been thinking about those coastal risks, but that gets integrated into all the other things that you do along the life cycle of a new building or a new piece of infrastructure. So you're going to need to take that time, or you're going to need to access if someone else is doing it, like if the municipality has done it or another organization has done it, you're going to need to take a look at what those risks are, how they've been assessed, how they've been planned for, but not just those coastal flooding and erosion risks, but there might be other climate risks you need to consider. Are you thinking about high wind risks? Are you thinking about basement flooding risks? Are you making sure that you're not putting all of your electrical in the very bottom of the basement of the building so that if it gets flooded, you immediately also have damage to your electrical systems as well? And then you might have shoreline management requirements as well at this early stage of designing and starting to plan this new project. And then as you move forward into more detailed design, you've got all those additional building code requirements. You might have local bylaws. You might be able to bring in some standards that we have on high wind, on durability to inform what you're choosing and how you're designing that new hotel. And when you get into actual construction, then you might be building those new nature-based solutions or other kinds of hard protection against flood, putting in those protections against your basement flood measures there, and considering what you need to look at during construction. So you might have to consider high heat days and the impact on your crews as they're working. And then towards the end, you're going to be operating and maintaining a climate resilient building. And that can include things like monitoring those nature-based solutions, repairs and updates and surveying to make sure that your choices that you made earlier in the design are actually giving you the resilience that you were looking for. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Steph to take us through some other flooding considerations.
Thank you. All right, let's get into it. So you have no doubt heard about how flooding is a recurring problem, and it's exacerbated increasingly by climate change, by population growth, and urban development. Basically, the more we build, the more people, property, and assets are exposed to flood risk. And yet, best practices are still being overlooked. You know, infrastructure is still being built in flood-prone areas, new subdivisions are still being constructed with poorly laid sewer lines, and parking lots are still being built with impermeable surfaces, just to name a few examples. But luckily, we do have a bunch of tools that can help address that. So I want to show you some examples of standards that we've funded over the years. We don't have time to get into all of these in details, but hopefully it'll give you an idea on what to check out. So highlighted is what is free view access, but for some of them, you'll have to pay to download them. So first up, we have CSA W204, Flood Resilient Design of New Residential Communities. That addresses communities' vulnerability against flooding. Then we have CSA W210, Prioritization of Flood Risk in Existing Communities, and that focuses on the complexity and the variability of flood risk. CSA W211, Management Standard for Stormwater Systems, um, basically addresses the challenge of a lack of common, consistent requirements for the management of a stormwater system. Then we have CSA W231, Developing and Interpreting Intensity, Duration, Frequency Information under a Changing Climate. And that helps to estimate the volume of water you could expect from extreme precipitation events. So it helps inform design and other stuff like that. Then we have two B&Q standards on inflow and infiltration. So in case you're not familiar, this refers to an excess of clean water getting into your sanitary sewers. And it's a problem that can cost municipalities and therefore, like taxpayers like us, a lot of money. So there's one standard for new sanitary sewer systems and then another for existing systems. NRC developed guidance on private side drainage to reduce basement flood risk, which is worth checking out. And then speaking of basement flooding, there's a standard called CSA Z800 on basement flood protection and risk reduction. And this was funded by NRC, and now SCC is funding the update, which should be published in, I think, March 2027. And the new edition will be free to view access. And for any of you who are involved in building or retrofitting homes, heritage buildings, or larger buildings, I want to flag a toolkit that's going to be published hopefully later this month. So SCC is funding the English translation of a resource from Architects Without Borders Quebec on living with water. Basically, how to build something or retrofit something with the expectation that you will have flooding, but building it or retrofitting in a way to minimize damage and costs. It's honestly, it's amazing. I'm obsessed with it. I tell everybody about this. There's also some tools and training available for some of the water standards and guidance that I just mentioned. First up, there's an online training course on the IDF curve standard. And these are all free, by the way. And then CSA Group developed a municipal guide for their community water standards. And this is another one that I'm kind of obsessed with and I tell everybody about. So despite the fact that this is meant for municipalities, I've included it because I find it gives a good overview of the standards, like these water standards, but it could also give you an idea of how these could one day be used by your municipality as part of their planning and their approval processes. And then finally, the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, they have a suite of training on flood protection, and of particular interest to you folks might be the one designed for home inspectors. I didn't include them here, but another thing I want to mention is that if you go to our published projects page, and there's going to be a link and a QR code later, there's a bunch of infographics providing overviews of these water standards. And that could be like a good, little cheat sheet. And actually, I have an example of the one infographic on the next slide. And I thought it might be useful to give you kind of a scenario for how you would use this standard. So let's say you live in a municipality called Marlaville. And Marlaville is located in a low-lying area. Now, the mayor's upset about how some new neighborhoods have experienced flooding, and they're looking for builders that will take their concerns seriously. You own a construction company and you're interested in bidding on the development of a new subdivision. Fortunately for you, you've recently attended a super cool Climate Atlantic webinar, and you have found out that there's a standard called CSA W204 Flood Resilient Design of New Residential Communities. And you learn that with climate change, there's an increased risk of extreme precipitation and flooding in your area. You also learn that there are more lawsuits happening when citizens are impacted by climate hazards like flooding, putting municipal governments and builders at risk. So you arm yourself with information. You check out this CSA W204 standard, and it turns out that it provides a direction to builders and developers on specific measures and practices that will result in developing more flood resilient communities and houses. Stuff like storm sewer design and street design. And when you put in your bid, it includes the approach you will follow based on this standard. So you've saved a bunch of time and effort, plus you stand out from other bids because you've emphasized climate resilience. On top of that, you have a plan to keep residents safe from flooding and reduce legal liability for yourself and Marlaville. Conclusion, your bid is chosen because you are the absolute best. Congratulations. Now we're going to shift gears a bit and we're going to talk about high winds. So you might be aware that the majority of Canada is at risk of high winds due to climate change. Fortunately, we have some tools to help with this, and the first one is a standard called CSA S520, Design and Construction of Low-Rise Residential and Small Buildings to Resist High Wind. Very catchy title. So this here is an example of a municipality's needs or initiative driving a standard forward as opposed to research or industry. So our story begins in 2017, 2018. There's a draft of a new home construction standard that was sponsored by the region of Durham, Ontario. And the high wind provisions in this were basically modeled on requirements implemented by the city of Moore in Oklahoma. And they were adapted for Ontario, for the Ontario context. I don't know if you know anything about Oklahoma, but they're known for tornadoes. So they have a bit of experience with high winds. So then in 2018, 2019, there was a foundational document that was developed as a basis for National Standard of Canada, and it was informed by the home construction standard. So this was developed by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction in collaboration with researchers from Western University, and they based it on research, damage surveys, best practices, practical experience, and input from an expert stakeholder committee. In 2019, the need for a National Standard of Canada was corroborated. They basically, consulted key small and medium enterprises. They consulted them on the foundational document. And then, we scoped the new standard, and then the new standard was published in 2022. So just to give you a general idea of what you could find in this standard. So the standard provides recommendations intended to increase the resistance of small, low-rise, so National Building Code of Canada, Part 9, buildings to wind damage, and they're focused on two things. One, in enhancing the integrity via more resilient design and subsequent bracing and connections, and also using stronger materials and installation practices of roofing materials, vents, and doors. So it's meant to address EF2 or lower intensity damage, although measures will provide protection from multiple wind hazard types, including events that exceed EF2 level impacts, so that buildings will likely sustain damage, but it will be repairable. And all the recommendations apply to new construction, but it can be used piecemeal for major alterations and additions since the standard is still voluntary. On the next slide, here we go. I love this image. I find it outlines it so well. So you can see that at high level, provisions can be categorized as either structural or non-structural. So recognizing the vulnerability of roofs to high wind damage, CSA S520 highlights the importance of ensuring roof assemblies remain intact by enhancing connection of roof framing to supporting wall framing, installing roof sheathing with tighter fastener patterns or higher withdrawal resisting nails than what's required by National Building Code Part 9, and also ensuring that there's a continual vertical load path to the foundation. And also, it recommends enhancing roof cover through application of wind-resistant materials with improved fastening and applying an underlayment that will serve as a secondary water barrier in the event that roof coverings like asphalt shingles fails. And I also want to draw your attention to that little box on the right side. We funded a cost-benefit analysis that the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction carried, and they found that high wind design of new wood frame houses had an average benefit cost ratio of 6:1 in Canada. So not nothing. And with that, I'll pass it over to Marla.
Thanks, Steph. So one thing I want to highlight here is a new task force that was established by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and the Canadian Home Builders Association. And so they have launched their Resilient Homes Task Force to look at evidence-based solutions for resilience of new homes and renovations. And this is really meant to be an extremely practical application of all the information that we have available to us on these different hazards. And so they've just recently published a set of tiered resilience guidance, and these are essentially checklists. They're really easy to use. You can open them up. They have a good, a better, and a best checklist for basement flooding, hail, high wind, and wildfire. And they all look kind of like the image that I've got on the screen. They're available in English and French, and they're essentially meant to be something that you can carry around as a homeowner, as a contractor, to say, okay, have we done these measures, and where are we on reducing our risk from these four different hazards. So they're super useful, super practical, and they're all informed by a number of the different standards and guidance that we've talked about today. So they're really distilling all of that information into these checklists to make them really easy to use and apply. So if there's only one thing that you go and check out from what Steph and I are talking about today, I really encourage you to take a look at these, because I think they're a really incredible synthesis of the latest and greatest on how we can be more resilient to these specific hazards. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about heat and the risks that we have from extreme heat under climate change. And this is not always the kind of climate risk that everybody thinks about. And it's not quite as catastrophic as when we have severe flooding events or a wildfire coming through, but extreme heat events can be deadly. And we have seen that the frequency and severity of heat waves really is increasing, even in places where we've historically had more moderate climates. And this is a problem where you've got buildings and infrastructure that's been built in a way where it's all more about keeping the heat in rather than keeping the heat out. So if you don't have an air conditioning system, then you aren't able to make that change. If you haven't historically needed one, then the building is not going to be necessarily set up well to be able to have one retrofitted into it. And you can also, because of how the wall assemblies have been done and the building itself, it might be optimized for keeping us warm in winter rather than cooling us off in the summer. And the really big concern here with indoor overheating is that you can, has a couple of different definitions, but typically gets talked about as having an indoor temperature of 26 degrees or higher over an extended period, and especially not being able to get any cooler than that overnight. So when you're in this temperature for multiple days, and especially while you're trying to sleep, that can really cause some significant health risks to people, especially elderly people who have chronic illnesses. Children as well have a harder time managing their temperature. And so this can be a significant risk for people. And it's really a big active area of research for solutions, and is a topic of discussion for the national building codes. In fact, the codes that are used in British Columbia have actually gone ahead and included a maximum temperature requirement, and there's some growing pains with that, but it is something that's kind of actively being discussed about how do we make sure that we protect people from these indoor overheating risks. We have minimum temperatures, but we generally don't have maximum temperatures. NRC has published a guideline on this and has a lot of active research projects happening on this. So this is something that, if it's of interest to you, or if you work especially in buildings that are more vulnerable to overheating, this might be useful to you. And I want to mention one very interesting topic area and standard around this, which is on playgrounds. So one of the really interesting pieces of work that's been done on extreme heat is around playgrounds, because the city of Windsor in Southern Ontario actually was a big leader in this, and they did some studies and some work because they have some of the hottest summers in the country, and they were finding that a lot of their outdoor playgrounds and parks were just not being used because they didn't have enough shade, or they didn't have water, and they became too hot to use during the summer, which is exactly when we want people being able to make use of these kinds of features and equipment. So the standard that gets used across Canada for defining playground equipment, CSA Z614, actually now includes some guidance in it on extreme heat and how to pick different materials and different, even just orienting the equipment in different ways, including considering the wind that is at that location. There's a whole different sets of design considerations you can bring in to help make sure that a playground doesn't get overheated and doesn't have that risks of having, burns from hot surfaces and equipment, or not having any shade for people to be able to sit and participate and use that space. So there's been a lot of different studies and work on this. If you go to the urban heat section of the Standard Council's website, you'll see more of these lovely infographics that have been done and other reports and information on that. But it's a neat example of how we can change a little bit about how we design to make sure that what we build we can keep using and make sure that it doesn't get abandoned in the height of summer, which is probably the worst fate that a playground could ever face. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Steph to talk about equity and to close us out.
Thank you. So we don't have time for a whole socioeconomics lesson, so I'll have to summarize. Basically, we're all at the mercy of climate change, but we're not all having the same experience. So due to a variety of factors, some of us are a lot more vulnerable. Climate change is what's known as a threat multiplier, so it exacerbates social problems that are already happening. Some of us are going to be more impacted because of where we live. So, for example, the north is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And northern communities, along with rural communities, racialized communities, tend to have underinvested infrastructure. And some people are more impacted because of who we are. So, for lots of reasons, women, people of color, seniors, and people living under the poverty line are disproportionately affected by climate change. So, I'm going to give you an example. So, I guess at the top, you have Kevin. And Kevin is a millionaire who works in the finance sector, and he speaks English and French fluently. And he also uses a wheelchair. So in a natural disaster, his disability could create issues of accessibility, but because he lives in a wealthy neighborhood and has access to money, he's more likely to have other places to stay and the means to bail him out of a tough situation. And Soraya, on the other hand, is an immigrant from Nicaragua who is in her early 80s. She's come to Canada to live close to her grandkids and only speaks Spanish. Due to her age, she's more vulnerable to climate hazards like extreme heat, and this is a problem because she can't afford air conditioning. Because of language barriers, she may not know that there's a cooling center nearby. So that's an example of how, different parts of ourselves and where we live can affect our experience. So let's remember that climate resilience is ultimately about people, and so is infrastructure. And considering inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in climate resilient infrastructure means taking into account the needs of the people who are served by whatever you are building. It means addressing the fact that the risks are different across groups. For example, the elderly, children, and people with severe or chronic illnesses are more vulnerable to heat risks, like Marla was just saying. So we can design schools, hospitals, and care homes with that in mind. And we also know that basement flooding can be catastrophic to people renting basement apartments who are typically low income. So we can therefore prioritize flood mitigation in neighborhoods where there are more people who would have a harder time bouncing back. So SCC funded the development of a guide on how to embed inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility within climate resilient infrastructure, and it looks at both portfolio management and project design. So the guide is to help end users, or asset owners, including private sector organizations and different levels of government, but more specifically municipalities. It helps them with decision making and risk management relating to their infrastructure by guiding how to prioritize construction, operation, and retrofit in the context of climate change adaptation based on the services the infrastructure offers, the users and their needs, who would be most affected by climate impacts and hazards, and how to address those needs through portfolio management and project design. So the guide provides resources, definitions, and it explores the benefits of considering climate equity as well as the barriers and the challenges. But the main part of it is a framework that walks you through how to incorporate these considerations in the form of questions. So it acknowledges that everyone is coming at this from a different place, and it gives you things to consider. So essentially, it's a really good place to start. So for example, like one of the questions in the framework says, has the location of your infrastructure been selected so that Indigenous peoples and equity deserving communities can access it? For example, are warming and cooling centers set up on or close to public transit lines or main roads that are easily accessible by the community and are not impossible or dangerous to get to, i.e., making someone with low vision cross 8 lanes of traffic? So I encourage you to check it out. It also, the guide offers a lot of resources to help with the process, and it's pretty easy to follow. So I definitely would encourage you to check that out. And with that is the end of our presentation. What you can see on your screen here is a QR code for the FCC website. This is the list of published projects that I was talking about. And the main takeaway that we would leave you with is basically don't reinvent the wheel. Like there are resources available. I think a lot of them would help with your work. And there's also resources on the NRC website. Here's another QR code and link. That's for stuff that they have either developed or funded. And then lastly, we are leaving you with our email addresses. If you want to chat about standards, if you have, ideas for new standards, if you have questions, whatever, please feel free to reach out. We love making friends. And then with that, I think I'll hand it back to Amanda, and I think we'll take some questions.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks so much, Stephanie and Marla. That was excellent. Super informative and really entertaining too. Loved all the scenarios, loved the visualizations. So that was great. Okay, so we're going to do a little Q&A. If you haven't noticed it at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you should have a little Q&A button and you can click in there and write in a question. I know we have a question already. You're also welcome though to raise your hand and we'll get you to unmute and you can always ask a question that way too. But as I said, we've got a question waiting for you both already, and that is, so this person's asking, what is the impact of using a standard that hasn't been updated within its regular update cycle towards getting buy-in from all parties? So the impact of a standard that hasn't been updated regularly towards getting
So
buy-in from all parties.
I will say that whoever the standard development organization is would be in trouble with SCC because it is a requirement for their accreditation that they maintain these standards. So they really do have to review, and usually it's the technical committee that developed the standard that would do the review to make sure that like there's no need to update it with new technologies and best practices or lessons learned or whatever from implementing that edition of the standard. And then, I mean, the impact of not checking, for someone using the standard, if there's a new version available, I mean, it kind of depends on the extent to which it was updated. But, it could affect liability. But it could also just like affect, like, you might not have like the latest and greatest knowledge, to use from. Marla, would you have anything to add on that?
I'll just add that occasionally there you might find requirements that refer to a specific edition of a standard. So if there's a legal requirement for you to follow a specific edition, you're going to want to follow that specific edition.
Yeah.
But it's still worthwhile to go check out and see if there have been any updates or revisions and see if it is worth considering or adding in or raising to whichever body is requiring, the 1972 version of a standard to say, hey, there's a newer version of this. Maybe we should be using the more recent one.
Okay, great. Okay, and next question, how can people get involved in the standardization process? Or is there a role for those of us on the call here this afternoon?
Yeah. Um, well, when something I just mentioned, I mean, there's always opportunities to suggest, like gaps that need to be addressed, especially for organizations like ourselves that are funding the development of these standards. So I would say that there's also opportunities to help us scope some of these standards, like, reviewing statements of work and like that kind of stuff. But one of the main ways that you could be involved is actually participating on these technical committees. So volunteering um, on these technical committees, as I had mentioned, they look for a balance of interest. They really need a variety of perspectives. So if you can be on the technical committee, you can also, it's great for networking and like learning from your peers. So you get a lot out of it, but you're also, participating in the standardization system. But if you can't do that, just participating in a public review, like reviewing standards and providing feedback can be like really helpful. Um, and then lastly, I would say like using them. Like once they're out in the world, like, like sharing with, with people and making sure that we're all advancing, climate adaptation. Marla, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I want to emphasize what Stephanie was saying about using them. If you put one of these standards into practice, especially a voluntary standard, it's great to reach back out to the publisher and tell them about your experience, especially if there was something that wasn't working well. They love to get that kind of feedback
Hmm.
because they have that cycle where they do update them regularly. They do try to reach out, but if they don't know that you're using the standard, they're not going to reach out to get your opinion on it. So tell people that you're using it. There's often opportunities to do case studies or share your experience, especially if you're doing something that's new and different. So there might be a university or another opportunity near you who might be interested in coming and taking a look at what you did. And NRC gets involved in projects like that. So we work with universities. We work with industry, especially small industry organizations through our industrial research assistance program, where we do have funding available to help with research and these kinds of things. So if you see a neat opportunity to do something that's a little bit different, it's worth it to look and see if you can get into academic or research networks to bring people in and see if there's a way to, we'll come out and do things like measure the impacts or the value of what you've done, and then we want to publish it. Like our researchers want to publish about it, and then that helps it get out there and show other people that it's doable. And I think one of the biggest barriers to implementing new ideas and new ways of doing things is that we rarely want to be the first one. So if you think you might be the first one trying something new, even though generally we can be pretty reserved and not want to, toot our own horn or make a bunch of noise about doing something cool, it's worth it. It's worth it to try and get that word out there. And Stephanie and I especially would love to hear it if you're trying something out or using one of these documents.
Definitely.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. A last question before we have a little bit of a break and then get ready for Yasha's presentation. We're wondering if there's anything like, or what might be new or exciting on the horizon that you might want to share in the world of standards and codes.
I'll let you go first, Marla. I feel like I've gone first the last couple.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. For me, one of the things that I'm most excited about that the NRC is working on is that we have a researcher who is looking at uh, the interaction between these overheating risks and wildfire smoke. So when you've got wildfire smoke, you don't want to be opening your windows because then you're just having that smoke come in and it damages your air quality and it has all these other health risks associated with being exposed to the wildfire smoke. But if you have that wildfire smoke at the same time as a heat wave, and extreme heat also contributes to wildfire risks, you can then sometimes have these overlapping challenges of wildfire smoke and the extreme heat. And so you've got these high indoor temperatures, but you can't even open your window at night to try and get the temperature to come down. And so we have a project that's looking at the interaction between those two, and especially what can be done to help, especially things like long-term care homes, deal with these kinds of issues when they might have, fairly old heating ventilation systems and what their options are. So really excited to see what comes out of that pilot project and what the recommendations are.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. It's so timely. So neat. Like, I mean, so many of us have been through that situation already. Yeah. So yeah. Awesome. Great to hear. Stephanie, anything on your end?
I honestly, we do a lot of cool stuff. And I feel like I have the coolest files. Like, don't tell my coworkers. But I love like the nature stuff. And something that's coming out in the next couple months, that I'm really excited about is a new guide on drainage, erosion, and water quality control strategies for agriculture using nature-based solutions. So, like how to slow the flow of water down to give the soil time to absorb it. We haven't done anything in agriculture before, so I'm like really excited to see what that's going to look like and what the uptake is for. And then farther down the horizon, we just signed a contract with CSA Group to develop three standards on natural assets, one on condition assessment, one on risk assessment, and one on life cycle costing for the management of natural assets. And everyone I've talked to pretty much about this are just like so like excited and just like really have validated the need for these standards. So probably, we won't see the first one published until, 2028. Um, but yeah, I'm really excited about this and they're really, yeah,
Yeah,
I don't want to reveal too much, but yeah, I'm excited about it.
that's excellent. Such a need in that area as well to have standards in that work. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, hopefully you're finding your way back to your computer if you stepped away and stretched and got something to eat. So we'll just ease back into it. Here we're going to hear from Yash with Recover. So I'll turn it over to you, Yash. We're excited to hear from you.
Perfect, Amanda. Thank you so much. Just a thumbs up if you could hear me. Okay, okay, awesome. Um, Hello everyone. On a late Friday afternoon, I'll make sure that the next 20 minutes, all of you get something out of this presentation that you can either apply to your business, your career, personal life, and or all of the above. So when we're looking at Atlantic Canada, what is the building stock? What are we trying to protect from the coastal environments? How are we going to have the coastal environment, the weather conditions actually affect us? And what does the data actually say? So that's the goal of my next 20 minutes to get it across to you in the most concise and precise fashion, and to pose a little bit of question to you to be like, hey, you know what? This data seems pretty cool. Let me go and search it up. Let me go and search up more about it. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please just put it up into Q&A chat. We'll get back to it as soon as possible. Now, moving on, the presentation overview is really simple. We'll keep it onto the objectives, the methodology, the building stock analysis, and concluding arguments. Like I said, let's move on to the more interesting little bit over here. Recover is really simple. Recover tries to bridge practitioners, building owners, and climate resiliency. At the end of the day, we are a deep retrofit accelerator, and we have programs within the community that involved feed studies, that involved architectural engineering through data gathering, and last but not the least, capacity building. And capacity building does not just extend to um, job shadowing technologies, but also it extends all the way out into community-driven programs. So when we're looking at what does Recover do, the vision is really simple. It's to be the first accelerator that gets that retrofits all of the buildings in Atlantic Canada. That's the long-term vision. In 2024, we were awarded with the funding. Recover was launched with the funding of Atlantic Canada's Deep Retrofit Accelerator. And 2025, we were recommended as we were actually awarded with Canada's Clean 50 Award. So we do have a positive track record, and we want to maintain and make the most impact as possible with the data and with just getting in front of people. So all the things that I'm going to talk about today is going to be published in a deep retrofit roadmap for Atlantic Canada. If you want to get access to this roadmap, please sign up via the QR code. It will lead you directly to our newsletter. Our newsletter will have all the information about it, and it is soon to be published in June 2026. There are three big pillars of this retrofit roadmap report. The first one is, of course, the building stock analysis. The second one is energy modeling, and then third one, but the concrete pillar is financial modeling. So without further ado, let's look at why do deep retrofits matter in commercial buildings? Why do we even care about deep retrofits? Glad in terms of coastal environments, but also in terms of the buildings and specifically commercial buildings. So our current building stock is aging. Majority of our buildings, and we'll notice this, is built prior to 2000. And if I may say so, if you look at the average building stock right now, it has an average age of construction of 1975. So we're 50, most of the buildings across Atlantic Canada are 50 years or older and mature. So that should be sort of like a wake-up call to many of us to actually start working towards this deep retrofit and reviving these buildings, because that's essentially how we will get forward. Now, I have a few stats written over here which tells you the makeup of buildings historic of 1990s. As you can see in Nova Scotia, we have close to 40% of our building stock, but when you include 40 plus 14 plus 7, you end up getting around 52%. That's prior to build 1990. That's pretty darn high. Second thing, cut cost, cut emissions. It's really simple, right? Energy prices keep on rising, emission prices and impacts due to emissions keep on getting severe. What we really have to do is by deep retrofitting, we can cut the energy pricing, we can have a better better environment and a better indoor environment as well. There was a most recent study actually shows that we spend more than 90 to 95% of our time indoors. And if our buildings are filled with asbestos and if they're filled with indoor air quality, which is poor, you can imagine what it will do to your long-term health. This is not just about rate cuts, emission cuts, but it's also about human factor. It is one of the hardest sector to decarbonize. And the reason behind it is that everything intermingles into one another. There's material sourcing, there's climate, there's people, and there's existing building stock and existing infrastructure. Then there's, of course, on the other side, what we consider as necessities, there's water that also intermingles with this whole infrastructure. And it's one of the reasons why when we are thinking about how we want to project and the targets that we have at national level, if we don't pick up our game with respect to deep retrofits, we won't hit those. Now, you're like, why would that matter? Well, if the climate risk and coastal environments are a big concern of yours, we had Marla and Steph talk about flooding issues, fire-rated risk. They're just going to get severe. So if we cut the emissions, we can get to a better quality. But let's look at the methodology that we used at Recover to understand this whole problem. So what we did first is we did a building stock research. Then we did a database creation of all the buildings across Atlantic Canada that we could source out, including their address, their age, the type of use, and the type of building itself, right? Then we categorized them into archetype selections. So we broke it all up into 20 different archetypes that cover close to 60% of our building stock. It's crazy if we actually understand that there are 20 different building types that cover 60% of our building stock. That means there's a lot of repetition, as much as we think that there isn't, when at a macro scale, there is. After that, for those 20 buildings, we did a facility condition assessment, we did energy modeling, and following that is the total cost of building ownership. That's how we actually conducted for data. But let's just focus on building stock analysis, which is the database. And when you actually understand what that database consists of, it's pretty much a bunch of federal data, bunch of provincial data, municipal data, private data, interactive dashboards, and retrofit toolkit. Those are the two kind of big products that comes out of this sector, which is why does this data actually matter? Well, we can actually build dashboards that you can use into your business to figure out, hey, how many buildings are of that age that need window replacement if you're a window manufacturer, or if you're a shingle manufacturer, do I actually have enough? When is going to be my peaks and troughs of my business? All that could be modeled within this database infrastructure along with the deep retrofits. So moving a little bit further along with that, building stock analysis of Atlantic Canada and energy consumption impact. So let's look at what does our building stock actually look like. And this is just our data. There's federal data that is a little bit that shows a little bit higher numbers than what we have on the screen. For example, the Nova Scotia building stock is around 420,000-ish buildings, whereas our building stock analysis shows 391,000, which is still less than 2 or 5% deviation. That's pretty darn great for when you look at the overall gross impact. New Brunswick is close to that of the same type of buildings. Newfoundland is smaller. PEI is around 80,000 buildings. But when you actually look at when you actually break that apart into residential, partial residential, and non-residential building, you see that most of our buildings are all residential. That basically shows that all the coastal environment that we are worried about, it impacts our daily lives and the places that we live in. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So let's look at how does this type the house type and the energy used by province. So if we are actually looking at the province itself, right across the spectrum, we have more than 65% of our energy being used just by heating and heating load, which to us, when we are thinking about the climate change, we're thinking about the climate actually getting warmer, that number, the heating load, will decrease. But if you think about it on the consequence side, if we have more extreme environments, then the heating load could also increase. So there's a big balance between how the buildings react within the environment and then the energy that it's going to use. So essentially, by actually retrofitting the building, what we can do is we can reduce the space heating quite a bit, because we will have an improved heating system. First of all, we'll have improved window systems, and then we'll have improved in basically wall and roof assemblies, right? So these are certain factors that we can improve right drastically. And then let's look at the energy use and fuel type within Nova Scotia, within Atlantic region, to actually understand what are we getting ourselves into. So when we are looking at our energy fuel type, no, in terms of just the total use, of course, Nova Scotia has a lot of heating oil. And what that corresponds to directly is the amount of GHG that we produce. So there's a relationship to what type of energy you use to also what type of greenhouse gas impact that we will have, right? What I like to say is that the situation that we are in within Nova Scotia, there is a good chance for improving our system, and how we make that get better is through deep retrofitting. The more we conduct deep retrofits, the lower emissions we have. Lower emissions we have, the better lifestyle we actually get overall, from indoor air quality just to outdoor air quality and just in general. So let's take a closer look at Nova Scotia itself. And the reason why we are doing that is just because Nova Scotia has, when it comes down to public open data sets, Nova Scotia is slightly better. And all of these graphics that you will see from now on for the next 6 slides, they're all dashboards which will be published on Recover's website. Once again, if you go on to recoverinitiative.ca and sign up onto our newsletter, you'll get an invitation to use all of the dashboards. So when we're looking at Nova Scotia itself and we look at the breakdown, we have residential building stock at almost 90% of our building stock. And when you break that even more down, we have single detached homes as the most dominant category. So if we come back to the sector as well, we're looking at deep retrofits. How do we create bigger impacts? We have to figure out how we could deep retrofit these single homes as quickly as possible. But at the same time, if we're looking to make a mass difference, then we have to look at how we could make a difference onto the multi-unit homes. So let's look at distribution by building category within Nova Scotia. You notice that if all of this were to be quantified into the single bubbles, again, all of these are play around like really. There's just dashboards that all of you, if you ever sign up, you will get an instance to play around with. And HRM region has the highest number of buildings that we have. So what does that actually convey into? So when we are looking at building construction and population growth itself, our construction, the amount of buildings that we're constructing aren't increasing, not necessarily. In fact, even the amount of square footage we are constructing is not increasing, but the population has kept on increasing over time. What that basically leads to is we have more population than the number of households available, and that actually creates a much larger housing demand. Why does this actually matter? Well, if we are thinking about deep retrofits and we are thinking about how we should conduct deep retrofits, and if our population keeps on rising, but if our construction does not keep up, we will get into big trouble where we won't have enough money to actually construct new buildings and conduct deep retrofits at the same time. So let's look at the building stock itself into a little bit more detail. This is the construction residential type by PVSC and how well they are. So if you look at it, most of our buildings are rated as average. And by average, it means that it's livable. It doesn't mean that it meets today's code or it exceeds today's building code. It's just livable. That's staggering if you look at right across the board from left to right into different types of buildings that we have had. Specifically, when we're looking at single detached homes, which is the largest category, it also has it has the highest percentage when it comes to lowest rated houses as well. And when you break this up even more into the date of the decade of construction, you can easily see that our buildings are not, as we get closer to the 2025 range, our buildings are not necessarily rated better. It's staggering when you look at that data. But let's look at the building stock development in Nova Scotia itself. Like our building stock is all around the coastal regions. That's one of the major reasons why coastal environments and building interaction matters in Nova Scotia more than it matters into other provinces. Because all of our building stock is across Nova Scotia, and we'll go through and look at HRM regions very quickly. And this is the data from 1990s. But if you look at it, and the reason why you have all these coastal regions is simply because of the fact that that's what the industry pushed for. That's where the jobs were, that's where the trading routes were, and things like that. But when you get down to 1950s, there are other hubs which are being built. If you look at the north, if you look at the right over here with the valley and things like that, they're getting more populated. Let's look at it a little bit further into 1990s. Oh wow, more buildings being constructed, and they're all into different pockets, but more densified near the coastal regions. And right now, the 2020, you can see how we have densified. We have not used the inter-province level, but the coastal region. So again, the flooding, the fire risk, and all that, that takes a bigger risk. But let's just look at HRM into more detail. Here's what the 1990s look like, and that's what the 2020s look like. The density of near coastal regions and the impact of flooding has increased quite drastically. And through this data, it's easily shown that we have built around the coastal regions where the major cities are and where the major infrastructure is, but we have not taken account into resiliency. The more the resiliency we account for, the better our building stock is going to be for the future. So what are our opportunities and what are our barriers? It's not all just bad news, right? It comes with the bare bones of opportunities. So when you're looking at the opportunities, it's GHG reductions, it's energy efficiency, um, energy saving and disposable incomes, increased property value, reduction of maintenance cost, resilient safety, improved health and comfort, and reduce energy poverty. Those are all four opportunities that we can take a step into. And the barriers that we have right now are high capital, insufficient funding, lack of holistic programs and efficiencies, and supply chain vulnerability. Where Recover stands is we want to emphasize the opportunities and remove barriers to the best possible, such that we could actually create programs that work. This is just a commercial trend, investment trend, and you can easily see that right throughout, when you look at it, we thought that, our investment into our total into our buildings would have increased, but clearly they have not. They've increased slightly, but not by a drastic measure. So you're looking at the fact that when you combine all the investment that's technically limited right now going into the building sector, that's one of the major barriers why we can't do deep retrofits. When you look at this right across the sector, you have new construction as one of the most dominant areas where buildings are being funded, and then renovations are the second largest category. You can see on this list, retrofits are not even on the list. So we are just maintaining our building or building new buildings. We're not really retrofitting them, and that will amplify the problem over time. What is our pathway to scale? The pathway to scale is public investment, finance reform, workforce development, data access, coordinate, and at the end of the day, coordination between all of them, all the different parties. And I do emphasize workforce development as much as possible because of the fact that we could really impact us in the near future. Unfortunately, I'm still over by 2 minutes, so I do apologize for that on a Friday late afternoon. But all I want to say is every building that we retrofit today has a legacy of resilience we leave for tomorrow. The deep retrofit revolution starts with those bold enough to act now. And we do need to act now for our data, and it's actually proven by our data to move forward. Thank you very much. And that's our e-newsletter. If you subscribe to that, you will basically get a link to all the dashboards as well in the near future.
Right, thanks, Yash. That was just as informative as the earlier presentation too. That was great. Really interesting to see those sort of housing density maps, development density maps, and how Nova Scotia's changed over the decades as well. And for sure our love of the coast here. So thank you for that. Now we have questions for Yash. So again, feel free to put something in the Q&A or in the chat if you like, or raise your hand. And even though you went over, we're still perfectly on schedule. It's all good. Yeah. While others might be writing their questions, I'll just ask you a very similar one to what I asked Marla and Steph earlier. I'm curious to know if there's anything sort of new or exciting on the horizon in the world of deep retrofits. What's exciting you coming up?
There are really the AI revolution has actually changed the retrofit industry quite a bit. It has put data on the map. We have been able to analyze data faster, better with higher precision. So let's look at evaluations of buildings. So there are a bunch of tools out there which are on virtual audits that you can do on your own home that basically really quickly quantify how quickly, what are the steps, what are the low-hanging fruit steps that you could do to improve your quality of your home. Beyond this, there are data sets that are being opened up with respect to people just wanting to know what are the building looking like in general. But from a retrofit perspective, it has a much bigger impact. For example, we can group a bunch of those buildings together, which are built in the same area, which are built in the same uh, year or decade, and from that you can determine what is the most effective retrofit strategies to deploy your deploy your um, construction crew, deploy your funding, deploy your allocations, and it helps all the way from federal government down to provincial governments. And of course, the standards that were set it earlier, they're extremely exciting because they help us do the deep retrofits.
Yeah, that it's all connected. It's all connected. That's
It really
great.
is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. We're gonna do just